And we're live. Welcome again to the Real Crusades History Podcast. We're continuing our series of podcasts about the First Crusade. Last time we left off with the Cilician expedition and Baldwin of Boulogne's establishment of the county of Edessa. This time we're going to be taking a look at one of the major set-piece events of the First Crusade, and that is the Siege of Antioch. My name is J. Stephen Roberts. I'm going to be joined by my usual co-hosts, Scott Amos. Scott.
Hello. Glad to be here, everybody.
Excellent. Welcome, Scott. Glad to have you. And also Rand Brown will be with me. Rand, how are you doing?
Pretty good. Glad to be here again.
Excellent. And we're welcoming back for the fourth time our academic guest, Dr. William Hamblin, historian and medievalist. Dr. Hamblin, thanks for being here. Welcome.
Thanks. Pleasure to be here.
All right. So, like I was saying, last time we talked a little bit about some of the activities in Cilicia, and then, of course, the very important establishment of the county of Edessa in Mesopotamia by Baldwin of Bologna. So while that was happening, actually, because Baldwin took off for Edessa in the first months of 1098, but even before that was going on, back in October of 1097, the Crusaders, the main army of the First Crusade, was arriving at the great northern Syrian city of Antioch. Antioch was one of the most impressive cities in the Mediterranean world at that time. It was incredibly well fortified. Antioch had its origins with the great conquests of Alexander the Great. It was founded by one of his generals in the 4th century BC. And it was kind of one of the great legacies of the Greco-Roman world. And it had been a part of the Byzantine Empire for a considerable part of the early Middle Ages. It was conquered at a certain point by the Arabs, and then it passed back under Byzantine control in the 10th century, I believe. Is that correct, guys?
969.
Okay, 969. So yeah, and that was during the sort of the energetic expansion and reconquests of the Macedonian dynasty of the Byzantine Empire. So it had recently fallen back under the control of the Seljuk Turks. Or excuse me, it had come under the control of the Seljuk Turks, but that was very recent. As recent as this whole issue with the Battle of Manzikert and the conquest of Anatolia by the Seljuks. In fact, Dr. Hamblin, do you want to talk a little bit about that? Do you want to talk about sort of Antioch, where it was at this point, and what had happened with the Seljuks up until the point where we are now with the Crusaders?
The Crusaders, well, the Arabs conquered Antioch in 637 and ruled it till 969. Then the Byzantines ruled it for the next 116 years till 1085. And as part of the ongoing conquests of the Seljuk Turks that we've talked about before, they managed to get Antioch as well. And by the time the Crusaders came on the scene, however, they had only ruled Antioch for 12 years, from 1085 to 1097. So it was still a predominantly Christian city, although with a very strong Arab Muslim minority. But the number of Turks in the city would have been essentially just a military garrison that was associated with the Yagisian, who was the emir. Now, the Crusaders came on the scene in the Middle East at probably the most advantageous moment in, the 100 years before or after the time they arrive. The Celtic Sultanate had been an extraordinarily powerful state ruling Iran and Iraq and Syria and parts of Anatolia, although much of Anatolia was under independent princes. But it reached its height under a ruler known as Malik Shah. he had a minister. His prime minister was named Nizam al-Mulk, who was a Persian who ran the state for him, and Malik Shah was kind of the king and the warlord. These two combined together and really created a massively strong state. However, in 1092, Nizam al-Mulk was assassinated by the assassins, and then a month later, Malik Shah was assassinated by some of his courtiers. And that plunged the Celtic Sultanate into essentially 13 years of civil war. So all during the period from 1092 to 1105, all during the period that the Crusaders were on the scene, the Seljuks, the great Seljuks, were in the civil war. And Iraq and Iran basically were not able to get engaged at all. They also had a 13-year-old ruler, Berk Yaruk, the son of Malik Shah, was only 13 when he succeeded to the throne, and he was run by queens and ministers and warlords and so forth. So, and then his uncles and brothers rebelled against him in numerous times. And it wasn't until 1105 that the empire, the civil wars ended, and by that time, the whole empire had fragmented too much to be of much strength anymore. So basically, what happened to the Seljuks is precisely what happened to the Byzantines after 1071. That is to say, they enter a period of decline and decay, at least temporarily on the Byzantine part, much more permanently on the Seljuk part. So the key thing here was that the Seljuk sultans were much more interested in winning the civil war, which really, I mean, there were truces, but it basically was going on for 13 years. That was their key political and military goal, not the Crusaders. The Crusaders were a sideshow from their perspective of the imperial order. Now, in Syria, the situation also was at its most disastrous from the Seljuk point of view when the Crusaders came on the scene. Basically, there were three roughly equal city-states in northern Syria. One was Antioch, ruled by Yaghi-Sian. Now he had been appointed by the great Seljuk Malik Shah, but when in 1092, when Malik Shah was assassinated, his brother Tutush, who was the lord of Syria, essentially becomes independent, and he has Yaghi-Sian as his governor in Antioch, and then gives his sons Dukak and Ridwan Aleppo and Damascus respectively. Then in 1095, Tutush himself was killed during this great civil war. He was a participant in civil war, and he dies. And when he does, Antioch, Aleppo, and Damascus become independent states, and they start fighting amongst themselves over who's going to dominate Syria. So when, instead of coming on the scene in 1092, when all of Syria, Palestine, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, and parts of Anatolia would have been one tremendous empire that could have brought in, resources from all over. They come on the scene when Syria is divided into three feuding principalities, plus other smaller ones as well, like the Arab dynasty of Shazar. So the Crusaders were extraordinarily fortunate for coming on the scene during this period and able to face very much weakened Turkish power in Syria.
Yeah, basically at this point, Antioch is kind of isolated. We've got Yaghi-Sihan as, what had been sort of a regional governor, but now he's pretty much almost an independent ruler of this one city and maybe some surrounding territory. And of course, Ridwan over in Aleppo and Dukak over in Damascus are really vying with each other in a big way for.
Right. They fought a major battle in March of 1097, just a few months before the Crusaders arrived. So, I mean, it was a literal hot war going on between them.
Yeah, and through a lot of the siege of Antioch, they're actually going to kind of ignore what's going on in Antioch. They do send a couple of relief expeditions on a number of occasions, but that's sort of the situation we're in right now. So for the Crusaders, they had made, as we kind of talked about last time, they'd made some considerable preparations for this campaign in northern Syria. They had swept the Turks out of Cilicia. they did have this long march over the Taurus Mountains to actually get to Antioch. They left Heraclea 7 weeks before they actually arrive at Antioch, and it's a march of about 400 miles to get from Heraclea in Cilicia to Antioch. And so it's an incredibly arduous journey because the Taurus Mountains are quite high and quite dangerous. There is loss of pack animals and men over the cliffs a few times. That happens. It's quite a perilous journey. But once they enter into Syria, they do a few things that are helpful. They capture this fortress of Arta, which controls the eastern approach to Antioch, and that will later be one of the major castles of the Principality of Antioch. But the Crusaders take control of it at this point, and also some of the coastal fortresses, Latakia, St. Simeon, and Alexandretta, which are very important. These are basically the ports that give access to Antioch. Tancred takes control of Alexandretta weeks before the main army arrives at Antioch, and there's a Byzantine fleet that's able to occupy Latakia and St. Simeon.
And that's operating out of Cyprus. So they have a nice naval base within a day or two sail of that region as well, where they can gather supplies and so forth, and fleets to assist in the siege.
Yeah, Cyprus is kind of going to be the major supplying point for us at this point for Antioch. So, okay, so the Crusaders arrive, and it's interesting. Antioch is so massive. There's 7 miles of walls that surrounds Antioch, and part of these walls actually run up into this mountain called Mount Silpius. So it's just, you have to imagine how formidable this city must have appeared to the Crusaders. There's these massive towers studding the walls. Antioch's really one of the most impressive fortifications in the medieval world at this time. So I'm going to go ahead and pass this off to Rand. Rand, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of this early phase of the Siege of Antioch, like what's going on, how they organize the camps, sort of what their initial approach is to all this?
Sure. I mean, unfortunately, I'm in an environment where I don't have my sources in front of me, so I think somebody else is probably going to have to cover the exact dispositions of each of the leaders.
I've got that in front of me, so I'll do that for you when you're ready.
I'm sorry?
I've got that in front of me, so I'll do that for you whenever you're ready.
There you go. But one thing to keep in mind is, like you said, Stephen, that Antioch was definitely one of the most, if not possibly the most, impressive city and impressive fortifications that the Crusaders were going to encounter on the First Crusade. There's even reason to believe that the city and the fortifications around it were even a little bit more impressive than what they would find in Jerusalem later on. Being backed up against the Mount Silpius the way it was, it basically meant that there was only one side, almost like one half of the city, that they were even able to really access. Although there was a very small gate with almost kind of like a very narrow trail that came out from the Mount Silpius side of the wall. So the first thing that they're going to want to do in a siege, and this was very in line with military doctrine of their time, was you wanted to, at the very least, control the access point to the city. So that's what you see. You see the initial dispositions of the besiegers focus around those gatehouses. They focus around those bridges that cross the. There's a small, almost sort of wadi that passes in front of the walls, and so that's where you see the initial emphasis with the the opening moves is to control those access points in and out of the city. And even then, Antioch is such a large city and it's such an impressive city that initially the Crusaders they're not even able to really totally do that. It's not until a little bit later, if I'm correct, that they actually are able to go back around to the rear on the Mount Silpius gate and actually deny that to the city.
They pretty much can only occupy the northwestern part of the city. There's one part of Antioch down by the southern end where it actually hugs the Orontes, and there's a gate. There's a gate there with a bridge that crosses over the Orontes, and they're not able to occupy that early in the siege. Basically, they're set up around the northwestern part of it, which there's a kind of a plain there where they can approach. Dr. Hamlin, did you want to talk a little bit about kind of the dispositions of the siege and some of the issues topographically that they're facing?
Well, it is one of the greatest fortification systems of the Middle East. And so what's remarkable about it is that, with a couple of minor exceptions, the Crusaders make no attempt to actually assault the city. Their goal is to create a blockade. And when you're blockading in ancient siege or medieval siegecraft, a blockade can either be a loose or open blockade or a tight blockade. A loose blockade is where you set up strong points around the city and you harass it, but you don't try to take it. You try to force it into submission by preventing supplies and economic activity and so forth. That's a loose siege or a loose blockade. The Crusaders decide to try to do a tight or blockade, but for whatever reasons, they don't do it initially. They start out with a looser blockade, and then as time progresses, they tighten it up. So there's a couple of gates that basically did not have, the St. George Gate and Bridge Gate didn't really have lots of forces initially. After the winter, they start blocking off those by creating some, they call them counterforts, but they're not really castles, but they're fortified hills or buildings that they add, gates and mounds of earth and trenches and maybe some wooden towers and stuff to create a gate there to try to control access. They never control the mountainside. Messengers can get in and out, but the mountain is rough enough that you can't bring in a caravan full of food. So, it is eventually blocked off, but initially it's a looser type of blockade. And probably the reason for this was because of the winter. The winter was coming on, and they needed, in the wintertime, it's very difficult to do military operations. But fundamentally, they had a supply issue, and they wanted to winter around Antioch, make it a loose blockade. Once the winter's over, they start getting better supplies, then they're going to tighten the blockade. So initially, it seems they were just there harassing the city, but weren't making major efforts to conquer it because of their own supply problems they face basically from December through February. Many of the people starved. Some of them say a fifth of the Crusaders starved during that siege. Anyway, that's the basic situation and their goals in this.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. The siege of Antioch doesn't really involve much assaults on the walls. Like you're saying, they're not really setting up siege equipment necessarily and hurling stones at the walls. They are attempting a blockade, and it's pretty loose at this point. Basically, you've got Bowman's camp occupying the northernmost gate, which is the gate of St. Paul. And then some of the northern French forces are in that northwestern corner. And then you've got Raymond of Toulouse and the Provençals in front of the Dog Gate, which is kind of on the northwest side of the city. And then Godfrey of Bouillon is occupying what came to be called the Gate of the Dukes. That's just that northwestern corner, basically, and that's what the entirety of the army is able to cover at this early stage. And then, like Dr. Hamlin was saying, in the mountains, we've got this gate called the Iron Gate, which is, they are not able to blockade at all. So there's kind of this, the thing about the Siege of Antioch is there really is this long period of stalemate, if you will. The Crusaders aren't really able to overwhelm the city by any stretch of the imagination. The Seljuk garrison is able to mount quite a few attacks against the encamped Crusaders, but they're not able to mount an attack that's effective enough to actually destroy the Crusader camp. So there's really kind of this impasse that endures for a long period of this siege. And the big problem, of course, you know, they're arriving in October, the winter is coming on. How are you going to supply this army, this large army encamped outside of the city? So that kind of comes to a head as the year comes to a close. And what we have happen is the army decides that they need to get some supplies somehow. And so the Council of Leaders, and of course this is how leadership is structured over the course of the First Crusade, is we've got these great men, you know, who are the counts and dukes, who are at the head of all these armies. They meet in council and hold a military council, and that's how they make major decisions. And they decide in December that they need to send a foraging expedition out to try and relieve some of this problem of lack of supplies for the siege. And Bohemond is actually going to be the guy who leads that expedition, and he goes with Count Robert of Flanders. Dr. Hamlin, do you want to talk a little bit about that? Like, where do they go, and what happens when they encounter the Turks out there on this foraging expedition?
Right. What happens is, as they get there at the end of the fall, there's some of the harvest still left. So they're okay through you know, October, November, but then they start running out of food in December through February. And so they send out expeditions to get food, and as they strip the food from the local area, they've got to send them out further. So first it's 5 miles, and it's 10, then it's 20. Finally, they're going out, you know, maybe 30 or 40 or 50 miles away from the city to get supplies. And they head out at this time on a road through the Rouge Valley that heads inland through a place called Al-Bara, and then on to Shaizar, and then on down ultimately to Damascus. So that's kind of the main road from Antioch to Damascus. And they're going up this valley. Bohemond is said to have 400 knights, and they didn't say how many infantry, but probably several hundred, if not maybe 1,000, would go along. And he's stripping this valley bare of all the food they can find. Now, this is in December, so there's not a lot. And basically, they're trying to go to villages and take the food from the peasants around, just, you know, whatever they can find. They're gathering food, and they seem to have had a fair amount of success. But at the city of Al-Bara, they're camping with their supplies that they've gathered, and they don't have scouts out properly, and Dukak's army is coming up from Damascus up this same road that they're on, right towards Al-Bara. So we need to understand that Dukak's army is probably a few thousand men. It's very difficult to do statistics on this, but we do have better records from the time of Saladin, and so we know about how many men these regions could muster for Saladin's reign, and it must have been about the same, you know, maybe a little less even at the time of the First Crusade. So we're talking a few thousand men that Dukak is bringing, and he is actually, the command of the army is actually under Tugtakin, who is the Atabeg, and Atabeg means kind of a father leader, and it's the title for a regent. When the Seljuks would send out one of the young princes who was maybe 12 years old or something and say, okay, you're in charge of this province. And the goal was to teach them how to be good leaders. And they would send with them an Atabeg, or Atabeg, sometimes it's called, whose job, it was the regent. He was to really run the show and teach the young prince how to do this. Well, the reality was frequently that these Atabegs seized real power. And so Tughtaqin was actually running the show. And he's going to continue as the ruler of Damascus for several decades and become a major enemy of the Crusaders. But at this point, although we say it's Dukak's army, it's really Tughtaqin running the show. And basically he's able to, they find the Crusaders and they send out their cavalry and they attempt to encircle the Crusader army, which is standard Turkish tactics. Now we need to understand the Syrian armies are quite different than the armies of the Seljuks of Rum, who were basically Central Asian nomad troops. The Syrian Seljuks by this time had started getting all sorts of other professional cavalry in addition to the Turkmen horse archers. So their tactics are often different than those of the Rum Seljuks and the pure nomad Turks. At any rate, they tried to surround the Crusaders and basically are going to capture them all. Bohemund and other knights lead some charges and they drive off the Dukak's men, who are, wherever they charge, the Turks flee. They go back, and then as the charge ends, they'll turn around and start coming in again. And ultimately, they seem to be able to break out, but the infantry and the supplies are left behind. And the knights at some point escape. It's not clear if they just decide to take off and abandon the infantry, or maybe they broke through the Turks' lines, and then the Turks reformed behind them, separating them from the infantry, so that it would have been kind of a suicidal charge to try to go back. But at any rate, Bohemund escapes, most of the knights escape, but most of the infantry and all of the supplies are captured by Tughtaqin and Dukak, but they essentially don't pursue the affair anymore. So it's a tactical draw a little bit, but more a victory for Dukak. But for whatever reasons, they don't pursue this anymore. They don't follow the Crusaders into the battle. Maybe it's because they've suffered some bad casualties. It's likely because their allegiance to Antioch is marginal. That is to say, it's not to their advantage to free Antioch, because they lose men and money to free somebody else's city-state who has been their enemy recently. That is, they're fighting against this guy. So they have a minimal interest sometimes in making a full-scale military effort to save Antioch. Anyway, that's the Battle of Al-Bara. And from the strategic point of view, it's a Crusader victory because Dukak does not pursue the matter and does not press on to Antioch.
Right. So yeah, this is kind of the major problem with this, of course, is that they're not able to get any supplies, really, right. Very few supplies back to Antioch. So it's definitely a disappointment. Interestingly, the sources kind of portray it as sort of this glorious kind of victory for Bohemund and Robert of Flanders. They talk about how valiantly they charged down the Turks and that sort of thing. Which, there certainly was some of that went on, but it is pretty disappointing that they're unable to really bring anything back at this point. So this is sort of the major crisis of the siege of Antioch. When we come to the change of the year, in fact, it's such a crisis that in January, Peter the Hermit actually attempts to flee from Antioch, and he's not the only one. There's actually a problem of desertions going on throughout this period of time. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people were looking at what was going on and just thinking, this is crazy. We're just sitting out here freezing and starving, and there's nothing we could ever do to take this massive city. And people were kind of slipping out through the ports, really. I mean, there was, those three ports, Latakia, St. Simeon, and Alexandretta were available, and they were under the control of the Christians. And so, one can imagine it was fairly easy for somebody to just slip out and get on a ship and, try to head for home. But Peter the Hermit actually attempts to flee at this time. He's captured by Tancred, who takes him to Bohemund's tent, and Bohemund gives him a major tongue lashing. So that kind of shows us what's going on at this point.
I think it's worth noting that Peter the Hermit was might describe him as a fanatical preacher of the First Crusade. And so he was a man whose, whole goal in the Crusade was centered around his spirituality. And for him to desert at this point represents a severe crisis for him and many others, I'm sure. That is a spiritual crisis, not just there's not enough food, but there's a spiritual crisis that's going on. And basically, the essence of it is that defeat, if we are God's army and we are doing God's will, which the Crusaders believed, then why are we losing?
Right.
And the answer became because of sin. That's the interpretation they come up with. So they come up with all these means, all these penitential rituals and means of purifying the army to end sin, restore the purification of the army so that victory can be attained. And so I just think it's important to note the spiritual dimension to all of this, because the Crusaders are there for many different reasons, but the core of the essence is their spiritual reason. And if they see God fail them, which many thought was happening, that's what's going on, God has failed us, then the spiritual core of their motivation can be seriously damaged. And the fact that a great preacher like Peter the Hermit suffered this crisis of faith, or whatever you want to call it, demonstrates that there's that whole other dimension to what's going on here too.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking when I was reading some of this. That must have been incredibly demoralizing, especially to a lot of the common people, to see Peter the Hermit, who really was a popular figure with a lot of the, more of the normal kind of maybe foot soldiers and some of the normal guys involved in the Crusade. He was a popular figure, a popular spiritual figure. So yeah, it does really show us where the army was. This was an incredible low point. And
I think it's worth mentioning too that Peter the Hermit has been through this before. That is to say, he suffered the loss of all his companions at Kviatot before the main crusade arrived. And he's probably having post-traumatic stress disorder type of a reaction to this, that, oh my gosh, this is going to be another massacre just like happened at Kviatot. So, I think that dimension of his experience probably contributed.
Well, what the Antioch narrative really does bring out, within the story of the First Crusade, is it really does highlight the human factor within the First Crusade. I think a lot of times, even in this medieval historiography, you kind of get everything is portrayed very almost kind of otherworldly, as sort of legends and epics. And here during the Antioch phase, you really do start to see sort of the human realities of the effort as a whole, come out, and the stress and the deprivation and things like that, and the fact that you could have somebody like Peter the Hermit, who is such a charismatic firebrand of a figure, even he's making what you might call comfort-based decisions, at the cost of his ideals. And you read the letters that Stephen of Blois and found the Revant, send back, and you really do see there was very much a dark cloud that had settled on the Crusaders, just due to their predicament. One thing I would say, I think someone's mic is on. I'm getting background noise. I think one thing that does need to be said about Peter the Hermit is after his kind of shameful display at Antioch, you kind of never see his reputation recover from this. In none of the accounts after the Antioch incident do you see him featured very much at all, or definitely not positively anymore. So I think it really did. I think that was kind of the last straw for a lot of the first Crusaders with him. And I don't think it was something he was ever allowed to live down.
Yeah, he's portrayed pretty negatively in like William of Tyre and Albert of Aachen and some of those. It seems like maybe the more lofty, or maybe I guess high churchman sort of sources maybe are more down on him, and then I think the Gesta Francorum kind of has a more positive view of him. But anyway, so yeah, that's where we are at this point. We're coming to we're kind of coming through this crisis of the new year. Does anybody have anything else they want to add about those first few months of the siege, or can we go ahead and move on?
Now, at some point, all women were expelled. Is that correct?
Yes,
that was around this time. Yeah, Bishop Adamar institutes these penitential practices. He's fasting, prayer, and one of the things he does is the women have to leave the camp.
I've always wondered, where did they go? I mean, were the wives of noble? Did this include just camp followers and servants, or were the wives of noblemen sent away? Or
it's probably gender segregation that's going on, and that's actually done in a lot of in Muslim mosques, in Jewish synagogues, and in a lot of medieval churches. The genders segregate for religious meetings, and so by sending the women away, they're not saying go away and never come back. They're separating them for the penitential period. And the fundamental reason for that is so people aren't having sex, which would, destroy the whole purpose of the purification. So, from the male perspective of a medieval man, women are bad because they cause lust. And so rather than dealing with your own lust in your own way, you blame the woman. And so if you remove the temptation, the purification can continue. So I don't think the women were sent away forever. They were segregated for the period of the penitential activities that were going on.
So they remained in the local area rather than being sent off to the...
I think they had a camp for the women that was made,
okay.
and I'm not sure. I don't think the sources are clear, but that would be my guess. Is they say, okay, all the women go over to this camp. It would have been in the rear somewhere, in a relatively safe spot, and that type of thing.
Just a few comments on this. There was very much that attitude at this point in the medieval period. However, as far as lay people were concerned, that actually wasn't a very common mentality. That was something that you saw much more heavily emphasized by the priests and clerics who were members, especially those who were members of the Cluniac tradition. You got to remember that the Cluniac reforms had just occurred not even a century prior to the First Crusade. So that those ideas were still very, very prevalent. And when they could, in things that involved a lot of religious fervor, there was that mentality. There was the, we need to purify ourselves. Therefore, men and women need to be segregated, at least for a time. Had a very negative attitude towards sexuality. As far as where the women went, you're right. The sources they're not too terribly clear, but I would definitely agree that they were not just sent away like forever, because you have not all that much later on after the siege of Antioch, you have mentions of the women and the the non-combatant camp followers reappearing multiple times. So the one thing I would bring up is that maybe it's possible that at this time the Crusaders also held some very key settlements that were right within the surrounding area, to include those key coastal port cities at Latakia and Alexandretta. So it is possible that when the women were sent out, they may have been sent out to those Crusader-held cities that were right within the vicinity, if for no other reason, just for their own safety, during the conduct of the siege. I think at this point in the siege, Robert of Normandy is currently at Latakia.
Right. Yeah.
And his contingent is holding it. So I could very easily see something to where maybe all the women were sent out towards those areas, just for the time being, to maybe aid in cutting down the distractions.
Yeah,
as it were.
I definitely wouldn't say that medieval men thought women were bad. I mean, I think that there were some different ideas about sexuality at this time, and there was kind of a common idea that women were, like, in our culture, we sort of view men as being the more lustful, more sexually aggressive of the sexes. In the medieval world, there was more of a sense that women were actually the more sexually insatiable of the genders. And so yeah, it was kind of a common thing for, this was a period of fasting. The idea was we're going to deny the physical pleasures of the flesh. And so that would be the purpose of, you're not going to be having sex with your wife while that's going on.
I think when the Cluniac reforms really became popular in the late 10th century, early 11th century, you actually had stipulations where husbands and wives were not allowed to have sex on certain days, and that continued on even long after the Cluniac reforms had passed away. Like during Lent, in the medieval world, during Lent, it was strongly emphasized, that even married couples had to refrain from having sexual relations with one another. So yeah, it very much was a thing, especially within the more definitely way more emphasized by the religious and the clerical circles. But at this time in history, it wasn't. People didn't just go and casually listen to a sermon and then go off and do whatever the hell they wanted. It was, that was still it was very popularly adhered to.
And I just want to say too, William Cook, I was just looking at the chat. William Cook just said, no medieval army could survive long without camp followers. Somebody had to do the laundry. I think that's a pretty good point. And that's one thing I've always thought about with these stories. We get this stuff from the clerics, the clergy saying we sent all the women away. You wonder, to what extent was that even actually carried out, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
did they really? Yeah.
Like? I mean, that's the kind of thing that the clergy is going to want to talk about and emphasize. But I mean, it's like, did Raymond IV of Toulouse send his wife, Countess Elvira, off somewhere else? I mean, it's just, it's kind of.
But yeah, that's the kind of questions I've,
a lot of this is really about prostitution and fornication within the army. And there's lots of times the clerical writers of the First Crusade talk about the soldiers, fornicating all the time, and that a lot of these women who went along may have ended up as prostitutes simply because they were starving. And what do you do if you're a poor woman and you're starving? Sometimes you can cook, sometimes you can do laundry, but at any rate, that's, I think, more than husband and wife stuff. It is illicit sexuality outside of marriage that is concerned to the clerics who are trying to do this penitence or penitential.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct. You're absolutely correct. There's actually even I can't remember which source it is, but the only thing that they even mentioned, I think it's Albert of Aachen who mentions it. But the only instance where like anyone is actually like punished for anything during this phase is an adulterous couple, both a guy and a girl, who were caught, and they're basically treated to a medieval version of running the gauntlet, through the camp. They're stripped naked, and they're made to kind of run around, and they're kind of whipped. They're whipped by like everyone they run past, that kind of stuff. So
the walk of shame.
Yeah, exactly. There was definitely more an emphasis on the illicit sexual activity, maybe not so much sexual activity in general.
Yeah, good point. So we just did about like 15 minutes on the sending of the women away. So okay, so as we're getting into this period, there's even further problems that come up. By early February, the supply chain with Byzantium had broken down. Tatikios, the Byzantine general who was there as a representative of the emperor, he actually decides he's going to depart at that time. And what he says is that he's going to go talk to the emperor and try to get things sorted out again. Of course, later on, this is going to be viewed very negatively. This is kind of the moment where the Byzantines abandon the Crusaders at Antioch. But and then in February 9th, there's going to be another issue. Ridwan of Aleppo, actually, this is, we had Dukak's campaign. Now Ridwan, who is the ruler of Aleppo, again, one of the sons of the former Seljuk Sultan, he actually is going to finally bring some aid to Yagi Sihan had been appealing to Aleppo for aid, and he starts coming up from the northeast with an army to relieve Antioch. Now Bohemond is going to meet this attack with his troops, and he's actually going to win a very considerable victory for the Crusaders at that engagement. So, Dr. Hamlin, do you want to talk a little bit about this
right.
event?
Aleppo is very close to Antioch. Damascus would be a week march away or something. Aleppo maybe a couple days at most. So it's whatever is happening militarily and politically is of much more concern to Aleppo than it is to Damascus. But he raises an army, and again, the Crusader sources, I think, exaggerate the number of men he would have had. He would have had a few thousand at most. And he, again, this would be a mixture of more professional soldiers that would be more similar to the knights, all of them using bows, but then a lot of Turkmen nomad types as auxiliaries. And we don't really understand what his strategic goal in this, but he's marching to Antioch. It's not clear if he thought he could defeat and drive off the Crusaders, because the Crusaders at this time maybe had 25 to 30,000 men, and Aleppo maybe 5,000. So tactically speaking, it would be very difficult for him to do that. I suspect his goal is to cause harassment and maybe bring in some surreptitious aid through the back channels into Antioch. But at any rate, he's heading there towards Antioch. He comes to a place that's called the Lake of Antioch, which is where Bohemond kind of sets an ambush. The Bohemond, the Crusader response is kind of strange because they seem to send only 700 cavalry. Why they didn't send infantry is not clear. Maybe they thought they needed them all at Antioch, or maybe they thought the infantry would slow down the knights. One of the sources says they're afraid the infantry will be too fearful and run away, and so they don't want to bring them because they're demoralized at this point, which very well might have been true. They're also, the infantry are going to be suffering a lot more from hunger and so forth than the elites, because they are much more poor and couldn't buy the money. Anyway, so Bohemond sets up an ambush in which he divides his army into 6 units, about 100 knights each, maybe 150 each. He sets up 5 of them, and he does it by the lake, where there's kind of a hill and a lake, and the lake protects one of his flanks, which is crucial when you're facing a Turkish army, because their tendency, if they outnumber you, which Ridwan would have outnumbered Bohemond here, their tactic tends to be to encircle you and harass you from front, behind, and side, all over the place. So if you get the lake protecting one flank, you increase your tactical strength in that way. The other thing he did was hide his 6th regiment, which may have had more men than the rest. That is, it might be a stronger unit. We don't know if these 6 units all had the same number of men. So I suspect maybe this had 200 each. The other 5 had 100 each, something like that. But at any rate, he hides this in a hill or some type of geographical feature that protects it from the view of Ridwan. Then Ridwan sees these Crusaders. He sees they're rather limited in number. He sends his army forward. They have a fairly substantial battle, and the Crusaders kind of withdraw. Now, this seems to be a feigned retreat. And as they withdraw to the point where Bohemond is now behind and to the side of the main Turkish battle line, Bohemond hits them in the flank. This would have been their left flank. And according to one of the sources, his banner was seen above the heads of the Turks, which means he was coming from the side, but also behind. And the knights see Baldwin's banner above the Turkish army in the rear, and then they, that's kind of a signal to them, and they all charge in. And the Aleppans have no idea how many men there are. There were only a few hundred attacking them, but for all they knew, this was 5,000 men coming in. And so the whole army panics and collapses and just takes off. And the Crusaders chase them for a while. And in the pursuit, after a medieval battle, the pursuit was often pretty deadly to the losers. At any rate, they flee back to Aleppo, and Bohemond then is won this decisive, or at least for the limited time period, it was a decisive victory. He didn't win the war, but it was a crucial victory to protect the Crusaders at Antioch from facing a major exterior army while still trying to besiege the city. That is a very difficult thing to do in medieval sieges, is have an enemy inside the city, you besieging it, and then another enemy outside that's harassing you. So substantial victory for Bohemond there.
Yeah, kind of one of Bohemond's great moments. Does anybody have any further comments on the Battle of Lake Antioch, or should we move on?
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, I've always kind of felt that the lake battle is one of the unsung, really impressive tactical moments of the First Crusade. And just I know John France talks about this in Victory in the East, but just the sheer amount of cohesion and command and control that had to be exercised in order to pull off what we're able to piece together from the sources, really was masterful. And it also ended up being this huge morale boost. Who've just gone through a lot of really rough patches that winter, and now they get here they took on an army that was much larger successfully.
And there would have been some nice plunder coming in. And, in a way, this battle was the first substantial victory. They'd had skirmishes and stuff that they had won and also that they'd lost. They had more or less lost to Dukak, but this was the first substantial victory against the Syrian Turks. And now they're coming out of winter. They've done some penitence. They win a victory after the penitence. And now the supplies, because it's spring, are going to be able to start flowing in better. One of the problems of the winter, too, is that sailing in winter is dangerous. And so there's fewer ships bringing in supplies during the winter than would be able to do it in the spring. So things turn around, and probably a lot of the people said it's because we have repented and now we're spiritually good again. And now, maybe victory can be ours.
Right. And another thing that happens in February is a Fatimid embassy arrives to the Crusader camp outside of Antioch, which this is kind of an interesting thing. The Fatimids wanted to strike a deal with the Crusaders, right? Because the Fatimids had been engaged in a long-term struggle with the Seljuk Turks. And the Fatimids actually want to propose a division of Syria with the Crusaders. At this stage, the Crusaders don't really make any promises to them. They are cordial to them. However, I think it becomes clear to them that the Fatimids aren't interested in offering them Jerusalem, which, of course, that is what they ultimately want. So, and we'll talk more about that later on as we continue.
It's worth noting, I think, that at this point, the Fatimids do not control Jerusalem. It's still in the hands of El-Ghazi, who is a nominal vassal of Damascus. Mm-hmm. So they can't, give up Jerusalem. But within a few months of this embassy, the Fatimids are going to attack and conquer Jerusalem. So that it is the Fatimids the Crusaders will face when they finally get there. And that probably reflects their understanding of the deal, which was you get the north, we get the south. And my suspicion is the Crusaders led them on in this regard. And so the Fatimids' response to that is, yeah, let's ally with the Crusaders. We'll attack the Turks from the south. You guys attack them from the north. We'll meet in the middle and split the difference. So anyway, it is going to bring a change in Fatimid policy, in that they take the Crusader attack and the weakness of the Seljuks because of that as an opportunity to take Jerusalem a few months after this siege.
Yeah, I think the division that, at this point, it's kind of a proposed mutual conquest, and the division that the Fatimids offered would not include Jerusalem for the Crusaders. But yeah, I've always kind of, not to go off on a tangent, but I've always felt like this was kind of maybe one of the great, it probably would have been very wise of the Crusaders. I mean, of course, hindsight is everything, but imagine if they had actually made a full-on alliance with the Fatimids, and they had, been able to thereby get the Turks out of all of Syria. I mean, this might have been a considerably larger or more long-term conquest in Syria for Latin Christendom. But of course, that really is not what they were thinking at this point. I mean, again, this was a very spiritual mission they were on. The idea was to get to Jerusalem. They weren't necessarily thinking, well, okay, how do we want to make sure that we're going to control Syria for the next 500 years or whatever. But anyway, that's something I've always, every time you get to this point when you're reading about the First Crusade and you get to the part where the Fatimids make their offer to the Crusaders, I'm always thinking to myself, come on, just take the offer,
Take it this year.
This is a good offer because the Fatimids are not going to be able to, they're not going to be the problem for you that the Turks are going to be. But anyway, that's just that's sort of a little bit of a tangent there. But yeah, and as Dr. Hamlin was saying, the spring is here. It's going to be easier to get shipping in. On March 4th, an English fleet is going to arrive at St. Simeon, which is going to provide some supplies and materials for the Crusaders. It's actually going to allow them to construct this little fort in front of the bridge gate, which up until now they have not been able to control, and that is the southernmost gate on the walls of Antioch that overlooks the crossing of the Orontes River, right there in that part where the Orontes River runs alongside the walls of Antioch. So this is the name of this little tower or little fort is going to be La. I'm not sure how to pronounce it honestly. La Mahomeri.
La Mahomeri.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hamblin.
It means the mosque. It's the place of Mohammedan worship type of thing. But La Mahomeri in French means the mosque. So
and is that because there was a mosque there before?
There was a mosque there that they basically built the fort using the mosque's walls and stuff as part of the fort system.
Yeah. So anyway, that's going to get done. That's gonna provide an advantage to the Crusaders. In April, there's going to be a tower built opposite the Gate of St. George, which again, that is a gate that had been a problem for them. It's one of the southernmost gates. In fact, it actually is the southernmost gate. And this is actually going to be called Tancred's Tower, and Tancred is going to be in charge of this little fort. And once again, this is going to allow the Crusaders to control that crucial choke point, if you will, that crucial point where the Turks can come and go, and from which they can launch attacks on the Crusader camp. So that's going to be important. However, also as spring arrives, off in a place called Mosul, further to the east, there's a guy named Kerboka, who is the Atabeg of Mosul. Again, the Atabeg is the father of the actual, or not the father figure of the actual ruler. He's kind of the regent, as you were saying, Dr. Hamblin. Kerboka is assembling a large coalition army, and he is interested in kind of taking advantage of what's going on, the problems that are arising for the Syrian Turks as a result of the Crusaders. He's interested in sort of setting up a large principality for himself in this region, and he thinks that he can possibly march on Antioch and take out these Crusaders, and in that process take control of Antioch. So that's going to be his strategy. And while he's doing that, while Kerboka is assembling this army and he starts to march west, the Crusaders start to hear rumors that this large Turkish army is on its way. So this creates...
Let me add just one thing here. Yes. Kerboga was the governor or Atabeg of Mosul, and actually in March of 1098, Berk Yaruk, who was the Sultan, orders the army of Baghdad and Kerboga to march together to attack the Crusaders. But because of the civil war that's going on, there's a big disaster that occurs in Iran. He countermands that order. The army marches back to Baghdad and has to fight, is essentially used to fight the crusade. So and then in April, he orders Kerboga to go alone without the rest of the Seljuk army. So it's important to note that if there had not been a civil war, Berk Yaruk, with essentially maybe two, possibly three times as many men as Kerboga had, would have arrived in April, late April probably, at Antioch, rather than Kerboga arriving in late May, early June. So
and that would have been it.
Yeah, so it's very important to note that the civil war and the need for the Baghdad army to stay in Iraq and Iran saved the crusade. They're able to defeat Kerboga, but it's unlikely they would have been able to defeat both the Baghdad Seljuk army and the Mosul Seljuk army.
And Dr. Hamblin, who is that gave the order to Kerboga?
His name is Berk Yaruk. He is the son of Malik Shah, but there were several other sons of Malik Shah, and he is nominally the Sultan of all the Seljuks, and therefore the overlord of Berk Yaruk, or of Kerboga rather, but he is in a civil war. His uncle's against him. He's got a couple brothers against him. His stepmother is against him, who wants her son to be the Sultan rather than him. So the civil war essentially negates the possibility of the main Seljuk army coming, and so instead it's the North Mesopotamian Mosul-based army, which is still big. I mean, it's a substantial force, but it's not as much as would have come if there had been no civil war.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, I mean that has a huge impact, no question, on what's going on for the Crusaders at Antioch, and so yeah, Kerboka is going to begin to make his progress toward Antioch, and one of the things he does is he attempts to besiege Edessa, while which is of course occupied by Baldwin of Bologna, as we all know. And that is going to delay him quite a bit. It's going to delay him. It's 3 weeks, right, Rand?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, it is. Sorry about that. I had some issues. No, and actually, Baldwin was, at least according to some of the sources, Baldwin was actually fairly aggressive when Kerboga came into his region. The Albert of Aachen, I think, even talks about Baldwin going out to sort of harass the advance guard with his Frankish knights and his Armenian auxiliaries. So there was actually kind of a delaying operation going on here, and was actually rather successful. Yeah, it was. It was about 3 weeks that Kerboga lost by encountering the unlooked for resistance within and around Edessa.
Yeah, and also Kerboga was going to be delayed by some of the stuff he was doing too, because he was capturing some of the local Turkish castles and fortresses. So he was, again, his goal wasn't just to relieve Antioch. His goal was to kind of expand his personal power too. So, yeah. Any further comments about this particular issue from anybody? Or Dr. Hamlin, did you have something? I thought you were about to say something, but
well, just that Kerboga is the strategic issue he faces is that if he leaves Edessa, his lines of communication back to Mosul can be threatened. And so he's facing a strategic dilemma. Do I go as fast as I can to Antioch and try to relieve the siege there, or do I stay and try to secure my lines of communication? And from his perspective, this siege has been going on for 8 or 9 months. There's not an immediate threat that the city's going to fall. Chances are it can go on for another several months. So from his perspective, he probably doesn't see any problem with staying at Edessa and trying to besiege it. And essentially, if he takes Edessa, he gets a new city for himself. If he saves Antioch, he saves somebody else's city, but it doesn't necessarily increase his own domain. So he's got some logical strategic reasons for staying there and besieging Edessa, even though it turns out to be a big mistake.
But wasn't Kerboka part of his terms for bringing aid to Antioch when he was communicating with Yagi Sihan? Wasn't he basically saying that he was going to become the overlord of
yes,
Antioch?
He wants, and he tries to get Dukak of Damascus and Ridwan of Aleppo and Yagi Sihan to basically all say, we'll stop fighting amongst ourselves and we'll all submit to you as overlord. So his goal is to make that territory submit personally to him, but then more generally to the great Seljuk Sultan of Baghdad, Berkyaruk. So, in part he's acting on his own, in part he is acting in the name of the Sultan, but the reality is he's using this threat to bring everybody into submission to him.
Okay, yeah. All right, so this really creates some anxiety in the Crusader camp. Obviously, it's very concerning, the idea that they might soon have to face a large Turkish army coming up from behind them and then pinning them against the walls of Antioch, if you will. Now, on May 29th, the leaders hold a council, again, as they normally do, and try to decide what to do about this situation. And during this council, Bohemond basically makes some intimations that he can get control of the city if he will be offered the city as a prize. Like, he will be granted lordship of Antioch, you know, to some extent. Now, the leaders of the Crusade Council, at this point, they're pretty, they don't have a lot of options, and they seem pretty willing to listen to Bohemond because he's done so well for them in the past up till now. And basically what happens is Raymond of Toulouse and Bishop Adhemar object to this because they say, well, you know, Alexius, he is the rightful ruler of Antioch. We have sworn to turn these cities we conquer over to him. Bohemond counters with, well, where is Alexius now? He's not helping us. Again, they haven't really had much help since back in February from the Byzantines. Tatikios has taken off. There's not much of a Byzantine presence there at all at this point. And, you know, again, there's not a lot of options for the Crusade leadership, and they agree. They say, okay, yeah, if you can get us into Antioch, Bohemond, the city's yours. You can have it. Although there is the stipulation insisted upon by Count Raymond and Bishop Adhemar that if Alexius does bring them aid before they're able to get into Antioch, that the city will go to Alexius.
We should note that Alexius is basically on his way to relieve Antioch at this time. That is, he's bringing an army, and he has been supplying naval and supply resources from Cyprus. So, you know, Bohemond is making an excuse that Alexius has abandoned us. I don't think he really had, although Tactikios had left, which could be seen as a desertion. Probably was not. But at any rate, whatever that was, the Byzantines were still strongly supporting the Crusaders by both fleet and Alexius sending an army along. I think he was with it personally. So,
right, yeah.
He was. I would qualify it by saying that I don't think, and you definitely get this from a wide variety of the sources, I don't think the majority of the Crusaders were aware that assistance was on its way.
Yeah, that could be true, right.
Yeah, and I think there was, and I'm not. I'd have to reread you know, some of the sources, but I'm not sure how much maritime aid they were receiving from the Byzantines. It seems from the sources they were receiving far more aid from Western sources to include, you know, mostly the
I think that's right. What I'm saying is Cyprus was a Byzantine province, and they were using Cyprus as the supply base. But a lot of the ships that were coming were, in fact, you know, Italian and English and all sorts of other groups.
Yeah.
But
and I think
there was Byzantines behind that, making that a viable option, as opposed to having to, you know, sail back to Italy or something to get some food. They could do a few days' journey to Cyprus.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I think it kind of shows that, you know, the whole story with Bohemond's contact with the Armenian Firuz, you know, it's kind of an interesting, you know, I have no doubt that when he sort of intimates this at the council in May, you know, I'm sure there were some people at the council who were sort of like, when were you going to let us know this? Like, you know, I think he was kind of, it definitely seems like he was keeping that kind of close to his chest for a little bit to kind of see how that was going to play out, and then. But as far as him trying to convince people that the Byzantines were not going to be helping them, I think that wasn't a very hard sell to the majority of the Crusaders. I think with Tactikios' very unceremonious and sudden departure, and with the relative lack of information that they had regarding the Byzantine support that was in fact on its way, even if it was perhaps very slowly. I don't think, like I said, I don't think it was a very hard sell when the rest of them were faced with the prospect of Kerboga's arrival.
I think we have to question too to what extent Alexius was really interested in relieving Antioch, because the way that Anna Komnene presents it is, he's already been doing some campaigning in that region anyway, in the wake of the Crusaders. He's taking control of some of these strong points that he wanted to get back control of in Anatolia. And Stephen of Blois, I should add that Stephen of Blois actually takes off around this time. I think it's June. Let me look at my notes here. June 2nd. Yeah, Stephen of Blois actually leaves the day that, that later that night, the night of June 2nd, is when they're going to actually do this commando style takeover of Antioch. So Stephen of Blois leaves basically right before they do that.
Worst timing in history.
It is the worst timing in history.
Then that brings up.
I think what that may tell us is that obviously this plan of Bohemond's, I don't think too many other people knew about it. I think it was I think maybe it was Godfrey, Raymond, Adhemar, and maybe just a few select others. But it doesn't seem that like the vast majority of the leadership was totally.
I think Bohemond was trying to keep it as secret as possible, and maybe he didn't tell anyone. But there's two reasons for that. One is to get the other guys to agree to give him the city if he's able to take it, and he wants to do that before he takes it, so he doesn't have to argue about it. But number two is there's lots of spies running around, and if the Turks hear there's somebody that's going to let the Crusaders in a tower, all hell is going to break loose, and every tower commander is going to be executed. So he's got to keep that under wraps for it to function properly. But he's also, playing a game here of Texas Hold'em or something, where he is not going to let the people know what the plan is until they've given him command, agreed to let him have the city.
Well, and he executes this raid with his own men. So this is, he pretty much it seems like the only people he really trusts are his own guys.
But I mean, everybody's ready though. By the time once they actually do this plan, the whole army is ready to actually go into the gates of Antioch once they're open and start, killing people.
It could have been, it could have been something as simple as, again, maybe there were only just a few leaders who were made aware of what the full plan was. But then once they did that, once they were made aware, they went around to all their, contingents and were like, hey, be ready. Like, something's going to go down. Be ready. And maybe they didn't totally know what was going on, but they knew, that, hey, everybody needs to be switched on, tonight.
Yeah. But anyway, so what I was going to say earlier is Stephen of Blois leaves, and what Anna Komnene tells us is that Alexius's army encounters Stephen, take on his way, back toward Constantinople, and Stephen says, "Oh, everything's lost. We're done," and Alexius, on the basis of that, turns around and says, "Well, okay, never mind," So, one really has to wonder if Alexius was really serious about actually going personally to Antioch himself. I mean, the way that Anna Komnene describes it, it kind of sounds like an excuse. Maybe in the same way that Bohemond's, insistence that they're getting no help whatsoever from the Byzantines kind of sounds like an excuse. It almost, what Alexius said kind of sounds like an excuse to me too. So I don't know. Well, we can't know for sure.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, we're probably never going to know exactly what was going on. But I think there are a couple of clues that can suggest that his resolve to aid the Crusaders was maybe not quite what it was made out to be, and that his approach towards Antioch, where he was, I believe when Stephen of Blois encountered him, he was at Philo, I can't remember how you pronounce that.
Philomenium or something like that.
Yeah, Philomenium,
Yeah,
I
that
think
was
is. You know, that signifies that he was moving at like a snail's pace. Like, so, you know, it's kind of like maybe he was just sort of taking his time to kind of see what was going to happen before he got there. And then maybe, I mean, hey, maybe if he ended up getting there and everything was okay, then great. But he had he was giving himself a lot of reaction time to kind of just see what was actually going to play out. And if it, you know, if it looked like the Crusaders weren't going to make it, then that was totally fine by him. He could turn around and consolidate his gains in Anatolia and just leave it at that, and maybe go get Antioch another day. You know.
Yes, indeed. So that kind of brings us to almost where I thought we would stop until next time. How do you guys feel about that?
So leave everything hanging. This is a cliffhanger episode.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah.
It's okay with me.
I mean, but
you're the producer.
But does anybody have any further comments up until now? I mean, I know this is a very interesting issue. This issue of, you know, why the council leaders decide to give Bohemond, you know, what he wants. You know, was Alexius going to relieve the city? You know, and then of course I think this guy Firuz is kind of interesting. I almost wish we knew more about him. He's just kind of a footnote. But yeah, Firuz is this Armenian who is one of the. I guess he's one of the guard captains of one of these towers, right? And so Bohemond, who is kind of the master of the spy network anyway, he's got spies running around everywhere. He is able to establish a contact with this guy. So, and probably part of that is because Bohemond is a Greek speaker, and this Armenian would have spoken Greek as well. So he establishes contact with this guard captain, and this guy Firuz, for whatever reason, I think there's several reasons given in the chronicles. I think even Anna Komnene gives a reason, but I don't remember what. But anyway, this guy agrees that he's going to let Bohemond in up into this tower, and that is how the siege of Antioch is going to be brought to a conclusion. So it's kind of interesting. Does anybody have any comments about this particular aspect of where we are now?
Well, Firuz is a Persian name, although some Armenians did take Persian names. There's lots of cultural interaction between the two. But I think it's likely that he's a Mamluk, a slave soldier. That is to say, he had been captured in, you know, the wars 20, 30 years ago. He'd been raised in the as a Turkish slave, and eventually had risen through the ranks. We need to understand that slave soldiers could become very powerful. And so although he's Armenian, he's probably a Muslim, at least nominally. And part of his reason for helping Bohemond may be that I'm going to go back to my Armenian roots and, you know, free Armenia with the help of these guys. On the other hand, it may have just been pure greed that he's going to give me, you know, 1,000 gold pieces and I'll let him in. So we don't really know his motives, but his Armenian nature is probably accompanied by a Mamluk status in the Turkish army. It's unlikely they would have given a Christian Armenian a command of a tower, because
Right.
Yaghi kicked out a whole bunch of Christians before the siege began because he was afraid that their loyalties would be mixed.
Yeah, excellent points there, Dr. Hamblin. So yeah, I think doesn't Anna Komnene say that this guy is a Muslim, like he's an Armenian who is a Muslim or something like that?
Yeah.
So.
I think possibly, you know, but one thing I think it does really highlight is sort of a little discussed critical vulnerability that you see on the Islamic side of this story, and that is that, you know, you got to remember a lot of these peoples that the Turks and even the Fatimid Egyptians are using armies. A lot of these people are conquered peoples, and they're from a wide variety of different ethnic, tribal, cultural backgrounds that are maybe not, at this point are still not very, there's very little love lost, between them and their Islamic masters. So
the wazirs of Egypt, Badr Jamali and Al-Afdal during this period, are both Armenian origins. And so, they have risen to the point where they're actually ruling Egypt. So during the Crusades, the Egyptian ruler is a Armenian, although he's a Mamluk and a Muslim. Actually, he's not a Mamluk, his father was. But so it's a very complex network of relationships in all of this stuff. But I should note that according to Nizam al-Mulk, who was the prime minister of Malik Shah and one of the great Persian lords of the age, he wrote a book called The Mirror for Princes, in which he describes how to run a state. And one of the things he talks about is that the Mamluks are extremely loyal to their lords. We tend to think of them, well, he's a slave, he's got some type of inferior status. That's not the case. These Mamluks were very powerful figures. Essentially, the slave of the Sultan is the ruler of everyone else type of thing. And Nizam al-Mulk says, your slaves love you because they want you to live forever, because their power is based on their master's power. Whereas your sons hate you and want you to die as soon as possible, so they can inherit the throne. So from his perspective, the Mamluks are more loyal than the children. So, which, is, whether that's true or not, that's just how he described the situation.
I think that says a lot about kind of the situation in the medieval Islamic world at this time. I mean, that's kind of, I know in that book, The Crusades Through Arab Eyes by Amin Maalouf, that's kind of one of the issues he points out is the perpetual coup, and like you're talking about, Dr. Hamblin, the incredible tensions that can exist within these families. The system of slave soldiers was kind of a way around that. These are people who are absolutely loyal to the ruler. And I do think we can really, people are very misled when you talk about a slave soldier. They think, oh, what was this, some guy in chains with a sword? I mean, no, this is somebody who's going to be living like a king himself. I mean, this is a high level guy who has all kinds of servants and slaves himself, but he answers directly to the ruler. And that's, how a ruler can really affect his power if he's got these guys who are just absolutely loyal to him. So
that's the way the system began back in the 8th and 9th century, was that the family members and the tribal confederations, their loyalty becomes increasingly suspect, and so they turn to Mamluks as a source of loyal troops that can counterbalance the rival family members and the rival tribes that threaten their authority. Yeah.
So some really interesting stuff. This kind of brings us to the end of our podcast at this point. We're going to leave it at the cliffhanger and find out what happens next time. Do they get into Antioch or don't they? We'll have to wait and see.
Well, we'll decide during the week and let you know on next time.
But before we kind of close it out, I want to make sure nobody else has anything else that they want to add. Does anybody have any final words or final thoughts? Now is the time.
I'm good.
Fine.
Okay. Well, with that, then I will go ahead and close us out. This has been the Real Crusades History Podcast. Thanks so much for being with us. Scott, thanks for being here.
Sure. Always glad to be here, Stephen.
Excellent. And Rand, thanks so much for helping out with this.
Dismal.
And I just want to remind everybody, if you want to check out a fictionalized version of of the events of the First Crusade, you're going to want to take a look at Scott's series of novels, To Shine with Honor, the first of which is available now. So if you want to relive the First Crusade in a historical fiction aspect. So be sure and check that out. And also we want to direct everybody to Dr. Hamblin's excellent crusadingwarfare.net website, which is an incredible resource for the military history of the Crusades. So we would definitely recommend that you check that out. And
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, this is Real Crusades History. You can find us at realcrusadeshistory.com. And we're actually going to be taking next Tuesday off for the 4th of July. So we will resume this the Tuesday after that, which is, let's see, what date is that again?
11th.
The 11th.
July 11th.
Yes, so July 11th, you will get to find out what happens with Bohemon's commando raid on Antioch. And you won't be able to find out till then.
Well, I'm glad I didn't bring up my last point. That would have given it all away.
Oh, no, don't do that, Scott.
I'm not. I just realized toward the end that don't bring it up.
Okay, well, everybody, thanks so much, and we will be talking to you later.
All right.